All right, thank you, and thanks for inviting me to take part in the TIP Talks. This is really exciting. I'm glad we're doing this at North Central's campus. As some of you may have heard, actually, let me see a show of hands. How many of you heard that Greece had a national election about a month ago? All right, some people, a few people. All right, I'm glad to hear that. So, as some of you may have heard, Greece about a month ago had a national election. And it was incredibly significant because the party that won, in case you haven't been reading the paper, was a party called Syriza, which is an acronym that stands for the party Coalition of the Radical Left. On January 26th, 2015, Syriza caught 36% of the vote, which was enough to give it 149 of the Hellenic Parliament's 300 parliamentary seats. The following day, they formed a governing coalition with a small right-wing populist nationalist party called the Independent Greeks, which gave them enough seats to form a government. They formed a government, which is headed up by, and you can't even see this, but Alexis Tsipras, who was a former member of the Greek Communist Party, and they appointed Yanis Varoufakis, a self-described libertarian Marxist, as finance minister. Now, I'm up here talking about an election that took place in Greece, not because I am an expert about Greek politics. I'm not. I don't speak Greek. I've only visited the country twice, and the last time was in 2007. I'm not really even a political scientist. I'm a communications scholar. So I'm up here speaking to you more or less as an informed observer who gets most of his information about what's going on around the world from the New York Times. Thank you, New York Times. But I wanted to talk about Syriza's victory because I think it has much broader implications. Implications not just for Greece, but for Europe, and really for the entire world. First of all, for Greece, it represents a rejection of a program of austerity that was forced down the throat of that country by Greece's European creditors, international banks, the IMF, the European Central Bank, and the Eurozone, who dictated to that country a program of austerity, privatization of government property, cuts to public spending that resulted in a dramatic increase in poverty, in unemployment, in homelessness, and social despair. Secondly, for Europe, it's significant because it is the first time since the 1930s that a party of the radical left has attained power by electoral means. And by a party of the radical left, I mean a party that is ideologically opposed to capitalism and corporate greed, and that puts human needs ahead of property and the rights of property. And so it is the first time. The Communist Party in 1976 came awfully close in Italy. Some of you may know, who's students of European politics. But this is the first time that a party of the radical left, since the 1930s, has managed to seize or take government power. And it's significant for the world, I think, because I think this victory is a harbinger or a foretaste of a possible global insurgency, popular insurgency, against the control of the global economy by the banks and the corporate elites. And I think that makes it incredibly significant. All right, so what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk just briefly about the context in which Syriza developed and the conditions against which they're responding. For those of you who are not aware of the Greek sovereign debt crisis, I'm going to explain a little bit about that. Secondly, I'd like to just say briefly what Syriza stands for and some of the forces that have, I think, propelled it to power. And then finally, I want to come back to this question of what this victory represents for those of us who are not in Greece and not in Europe. All right. So just a quick background about what Syriza is reacting against. As probably all of you know, starting in December of 2007, 2008, 2009, the world economy suffered from a global recession. It's sometimes called the Great Recession. It was a dramatic economic downturn, and during that recession, Greece's national debt skyrocketed. And you can see here from this chart that it rose from being in 2005. The Greek national debt was about equal to the Greek gross domestic product, right? So it was about 100% of the GDP. It rose to about 100 at the peak to about 180% of GDP. So they were deeply, deeply indebted, and there were fears that among Greece's creditors, who are mainly banks in Europe, German banks and the European Central Bank, there were fears that Greece was going to default on its loans, that it was not going to be able to make its loan payments, and if that happened, Greece would be forced to leave the Eurozone. They would have to adopt a different currency, they'd have to go back to the drachma. And none of Greece's creditors wanted that to happen, and so they entered into some negotiations, the kind of negotiations that the Godfather had with many of his his clients, over terms for the repayment of this debt, and they arrived at what's sometimes called the Memorandum of Understanding. So the Troika, and I'll refer back to the Troika again, which consisted of the Eurozone, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, proposed to Greece a bailout loan, so to enable it to keep up with its repayments of its debt, of 110 billion euros. So it represents about, I don't know, 300 at the time, about $350 billion. That came with very serious strings attached, and I want to talk about the conditions. So what these creditors demanded from the Greek government in return for this bailout loan was austerity, very steep cuts to public services and to government spending. And this was rolled out over the space of about 3 years in a series of 7 so-called austerity packages that were sort of negotiated with the various governments and Greece's creditors. It entailed ultimately the layoff of 150,000 public employees, salary freezes for all government workers, decreases in pension payments, an increase in the retirement age, went from 61 to 65. 65 sounds pretty good to us Americans, but in Europe that's a scandal. And really, and I'm going to come back to this, very dramatic cuts to public spending on health care and other public services. And this naturally produced suffering on a mass scale. So the economic output of the country declined by roughly a quarter, 26%. Wages have declined in Greece by something like 30% or more. 6 out of every 10 Greek youth are unemployed, and I think the unemployment rate in the country is about 30%. And 3 million, and really remember they dictated cuts to healthcare. What the Troika said was, you can't spend more than 6% of your national budget on healthcare, and so they had to really dramatically cut back on healthcare spending. 3 million Greeks are now without healthcare as a result. 40% of all the hospitals were closed down. 6,000 doctors at public clinics were laid off. It was a huge crisis. Naturally, this kind of austerity did not pass without resistance. In fact, there was massive public resistance to the terms that were being dictated to the Greek governments by the so-called Troika. There were hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets in protests in 2011, 2012. Many of the protests took place in this main central square in Athens, Syntagma Square, and there was actually an occupation, mostly led by young people, but also by some labor unions, of the square that was very similar to the occupation that took place in Zuccotti Park during the Occupy Wall Street demonstrations. In addition to these mass demonstrations, which occurred sort of on a weekly basis and then later on a monthly basis. There were also some labor actions, and most recently in November of 2014, there was a 24-hour general strike where the few public sector workers who still had jobs went out on strike, and a number of other workers went out on strike in sympathy. Syriza, this coalition of the radical left, has really capitalized on the energy in the streets, the opposition of the masses to these austerity measures, to kind of very rapidly go from being a very marginal political player to being the governing party. Just very quickly, I won't go into sort of all the ins and outs of Syriza, but Syriza started out as a coalition of communist, socialist, feminist, and green or ecological parties who united around a common platform, and then by 2012 they were only running candidates under the Syriza banner. No longer were the individual members of the coalition running individual candidates, and in 2013 they decided all of the existing parties that were part of the coalition would dissolve into the overarching party. So it's now one party, even though they have coalition in their title. So here's what they stand for. They issued a manifesto called the Thessaloniki, I think, program that demanded, among other things, the writing off of the majority of the public debt of Greece and other highly indebted European countries like Italy, Portugal, Spain. They demanded a European New Deal, massive public investment to rebuild infrastructure and to create jobs. They demanded free electricity for the poor, free public transit for the poor and for the unemployed, free medical care for the uninsured, unemployed, a repeal on the tax increase on heating fuel, and a 12-month moratorium on persecutors of debtors who have zero income, which in a country like Greece is quite a few of the people who are in debt. And finally, a suspension of home foreclosures on houses worth less than 300,000 euro. All right, and it was on the strength of that program, right, that Syriza went from victory to victory. So back in 2007, Syriza captured something like 5% of the vote. All of the coalition parties together captured something like 5% of the vote in elections. By 2012, Syriza was the second highest vote getter in the elections, but remained in the opposition, and I think had something like 23 seats in the parliament. And then, by 2014, despite warnings that were issued, and this is one of the most astounding things about the most recent election, is that leaders, especially the financial ministers of Germany and some of the other EU member states, were warning Greece, do not elect Syriza, right? They were making all sorts of threats about the apocalypse that would happen if the Greek people dared to vote for this anti-austerity, anti-capitalist party. They thumbed their nose at the EU, at the Troika, and they cast their ballots for Syriza. Now, I have to just say, if some of you have been following the news, you may realize that Syriza has had to back down a little bit from some of their demands in recent negotiations with their creditors. And just recently, they announced an extension for a 4-month only period of the terms of the memorandum and of the austerity package that was already in place. So it's by no means clear that they're going to be able to get everything that they called for in their program. But I want to ask sort of why does it matter? And the first reason, and the real reason it matters is it's summed up by this slogan, which you probably saw if you went to any demonstrations in the past couple of years downtown Chicago, any of the Occupy demonstrations. We are all Greeks now. And you saw this banner, popping up all over Europe, and all over demonstrations around the world. And what that means is we are all living under the threat of austerity, right? And take a look simply at the situation here in Illinois. We now have a Republican governor, Bruce Rauner, who was a billionaire businessman who unveiled a budget that calls for very steep cuts to public spending, including, for those of us in higher education who are concerned about this, a cut of $200 million from the budget for the University of Illinois. So austerity is coming for all of us, right? It's coming for all of us. Bruce Rauner is going to impose it here in the state of Illinois. Scott Walker is imposing it up in Wisconsin. Rahm Emanuel, if he does get reelected, is pledged to continue to impose austerity and has been imposing economic austerity on the city of Chicago. So what does Syriza mean? What does the victory of Syriza mean? Irrespective of whether or not they get any of the things that are on their program, on the Thessaloniki program, the manifesto, what it means is hope, right? There is hope that there is another way, that we don't simply have to kowtow to the demands of bankers and billionaires, and that we can control our economic destiny and our future ourselves. Thanks.